The proposed spending is primarily for the Canadian carbon rebate, which will provide $2.6 billion for small businesses and an additional $307 million for individuals. Non-budgetary expenditures reflect planned financial assistance to Ukraine and investment in the World Bank's capacity to help developing countries, and I would really hope that my Conservative colleagues would support these measures as well. I urge Conservatives in particular to stop playing partisan games so that MPs can debate important legislation. Mes fonctionnaires qui m'ont commis.
My staff and I will be happy to answer any questions you may have for an hour. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll start with Mrs. Cusi for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Minister, for returning to this committee. You know, your opening it's beyond rich. I'm going to read some facts to you about your government, Minister, that I'm sure you're very well aware of. CEBA reported yesterday $3.5 billion in funds that were awarded to those who should not have received them. We've had the ArriveCAN scam scandal, $9 million NYC condo, and this is the most expensive government in the history of Canada. And you're coming here and accusing us of playing political games at a time when your government has been completely irresponsible. And as I've said repeatedly in this committee, you are the one minister who holds the purse strings. I'm actually shocked the Prime Minister gave you another job, considering the responsibility that you hold as president of the Treasury Board. Your effort should be entirely focused here as president of the Treasury Board on reducing the deficit. Because I will also remind you that from April to September of this year, the deficit is already $8.2 billion higher than it was the year before. The PBO that we have coming in the following hour said that you will miss the deficit target by $6.8 billion. So that's my first question to you. Is this number even accurate, $6.8 billion? Tell us today, Minister, how bad is the number? Tell Canadians.
Well, what I will tell Canadians is that unlike the Conservatives who vote against supports for Canadians at every step, whether it is the National School Food Program, whether it is the dental care program, whether it is the Canadian Armed Forces, whether it is affordable housing or Jordan's Principle, the Conservatives vote against Canadians every single time. So I find it strange that you can say you actually do support Canadians and you do care about Canadians when you vote against Canadians at every turn. So the question,
okay, so like
really
the Prime Minister, it's clear
concerning for
you don't know the number.
Of the
Prime Minister showed Pierre Poilievre he didn't know the number last week, and like the Prime Minister, you don't know the number. Then tell me the number. Tell me the number.
I know the numbers. And
tell me the number. What's the deficit going to be this year? Tell the number to Canadians, please.
We are definitely engaged with all the departments in the government, including the Department of Finance, that holds the purse strings in terms of our budgetary commitments, and we will be ensuring that the public accounts are delivered by the end of the year where all of the numbers will be contained.
Minister, now you come in here and you talk about all of these programs and how you are taking care of Canadians. Yeah, you can't even take care of the public service, and it's evident now. As it was quoted in Options this week, if you lay out the puzzle pieces as we head into the fiscal update, it becomes clear that there is no path forward for this government that doesn't go through the public service. You can even keep your promise to them to take care of them, to hold their jobs. Why should Canadians believe that you can take responsibility for them when you can't even take responsibility for the public service?
Again,
so you have stated now that you are going to look beyond attrition to cuts in the public service. We know from your track record, we know from our work on McKinsey, we know from the Accenture information released yesterday with the Auditor General that you won't do it alone. So can you share with Canadians, please, who have you hired to help you complete the layoffs in the public service?
Again, more inaccurate statements from my honorable colleague. I would first of all like to thank the public servants for their incredibly hard work. I would also like to say that our government will not be adopting DRAP-style measures like previous Conservative governments have done. We are continuing services
So
to
what are you going to do to
Canadians
save the money then,
without
Minister?
any
You have this
impact
deficit.
to
You haven't
delivery.
met your deficits in recent years. The PBO says that you are overshooting the number that you gave already. You haven't been able to give a number here
we
today.
will
What are you
continue
going to
to
do?
be here for
When you
public
arrived in this
servants.
position, not this past summer, but the summer before, you were so enthusiastic, so peachy keen about all the savings that you were going to find, and you haven't found these savings, Minister.
Again.
In fact, your financial position is worse. So tell Canadians today, what do you plan to do? You've let down the public service.
Mr.
Or are you going to
Chair,
let down the Canadians
Chair,
as well?
Those statements are inaccurate. We have actually saved on professional services approximately $800 million, and we have instituted a number of reforms to ensure that there is more discipline in the system relating to contracting with third parties. I announced those last March. They include an updated manager's guide. They include a revised directive on the conflict of interest. They include a horizontal audit, and they include the development of a risk and compliance process. So all of those measures, in addition to reducing the government's reliance on third-party contractors, must be taken into account, and they certainly weren't reflected in the honourable member's questions.
Yeah, but was reflected was the continued debt, the continued deficit, you letting down Canadians, and which increases their taxes. You're talking about all these programs. You don't seem to understand that these programs cost money, that they add, in fact, to the burden of Canadians, because you are not keeping your promise to the public service or to Canadians, as is evidenced by the continued deficits, including the one this year, and you can't even tell me what it is.
Perhaps
Thank
the
you very
honourable
much,
member
Mr.
can
Chair.
explain why she's going to vote against
we will
400,000
now go
children
to,
and voting against
sorry,
the
it's-
National School Food
Sorry,
Program.
I have the floor.
That's the
I
question.
have the floor here, Minister. We said we'd stick to specific time. Mrs. Kusi, please, for 5.
Thank you, Chair. Okay, Minister, as was reported in the Ottawa Citizen yesterday, you have begun a multi-billion-dollar spending review. So can you please share with the committee what is the name of the third-party organization, the consulting firm, that is helping you with this multi-billion-dollar spending review?
I have no knowledge of any third-party contractor that is assisting with this process, but I will turn to the officials in case they have knowledge.
You should have
on
knowledge
this.
of everything, first of all. I'll start by saying that. But Mr. Matthews, briefly,
Just
please.
to add from a TBS perspective, where we are, organizing and running the RGS2 initiative through the expenditure management sector. There's no contractors or companies been hired. What we cannot say is, has any department specifically hired a consulting resource to help them develop their own proposals? We would not have line of sight into that.
But again, as the Treasury Board, the overseer of all the departments regarding finances, I would expect there to be knowledge of that. So, Minister, if I were to do an OPQ, there would be nothing that would come up on a third party relative to this process outside of what Mr. Matthews has said.
Mr. Matthews' comments are ones that I support.
Okay. And if I were to do an ATIP, I wouldn't find any information currently on a third-party consulting firm.
You're welcome to file any type of report that you want, whether it's an OPQ or an ATIP. I'm telling you what I know
Okay.
in honesty.
I appreciate that. So you are telling me then that the Trudeau government is doing this all on its own right now. It's being completely handled by your Prime Minister and yourself as Minister of the Treasury Board.
I am telling you that the process that we are following is that I have sent a letter to each minister to provide me with details regarding how they're going to meet the targets relating to refocus government spending, including reducing the size of the public service by 5,000 through natural attrition. We are receiving those submissions now. We will review them and we will table results in the main estimates if all goes well.
Okay, thank you. So that from a government whereby the PBO says that you are $6.8 billion over your deficit. And as far as you know, the Trudeau government under your leadership, under the Prime Minister, is managing all of this. God help us all. Minister, I will go on to my next subject now, which is something that has been very dear to this committee, and that is the ArriveCAN scandal. You promised this committee several months ago, possibly a year ago now, that you would recoup the $64 million from the fraudsters and the scamsters that took money out of the pockets of Canadians. You told this committee, you told Canadians that you would recoup this money. This, of course, is a scandal that is under RCMP investigation and is house ordered for review to return the money. So my question for you today on behalf of Canadians is, how much money of the $64 million have you recovered, Minister?
The RCMP investigation is continuing, and I said when we receive the report of the RCMP, we will recoup lost monies of Canadian taxpayers.
Okay, that sounds like a zero. But I'm sure you have a process in place that you have started. What type of confirmations have you received when this process is completed of funds that you will recoup, where certain vendors perhaps have said, as soon as this process is completed, we will hand over these funds, we will return these funds? What commitments have you received in terms of funds expected to be returned back to you? What commitments have you received? A number, please.
Mr. Chair, as I mentioned, the RCMP investigation is ongoing. We have a commitment to recoup taxpayer dollars at every turn. We have accepted the recommendations of the Auditor General relating to those issues, and we will continue to ensure that we adhere to the recommendations. That's why I implemented reforms in March 2024, revised directive on conflict of
sorry,
interest,
we're past
increased
our time.
contract
Where's the money?
information,
Where's the money,
horizontal
Minister?
audit.
Please
You're
get
gonna go
Canadians.
to,
As soon as we
Thank
have a
you.
I'm
report from the
sorry, we are past our
RCMP, we
time,
will
both
move
of
on.
you. We're going to miss out.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister. I was surprised to see the government vote in favor of my motion to ban double dipping. That was a motion to prevent government employees from doubling as outside contractors. Pleasantly surprised. Will the government now implement this motion and finally ban double dipping?
Thank you to my honorable colleague for bringing forward that motion. And as you know, we are continuously looking at how to inject more discipline into the system. That's why I introduced the revised directive on conflict of interest, which directly addresses the point that my honorable colleague is making, as well as the horizontal audit and
Okay,
the
Minister. Sorry,
decision-making.
just to jump in though, my question is specific. It's about a motion that you voted for in the House of Commons, as did your colleagues. That motion wasn't to reaffirm these various other policies. It was to outright and completely ban the practice of double dipping. Is it the intention of the government to follow through on the unanimous vote of the House of Commons and ban outright double dipping, which I think you'll acknowledge goes further than these existing policies?
Well, again, thank my honorable colleague for bringing forward the motion and for voting in favor of it. We, as I said, are continually looking at how we can improve the directive on conflict of interest. We've revised it already this year, and we're looking at further ways we can strengthen the
So
conflicts
can I
of interest
infer from that a
policy.
decision hasn't been made yet on whether to actually implement this motion? Because if you're continually looking at that, sounds like you're saying we might, but we haven't decided yet.
As I said, I'm very committed to ensuring that we have stringent rules in place relating to the directive on conflict of interest, and with other ministers, we'll continually look at how that can be strengthened and improved.
Okay, I don't think we got a clear answer, and I would have thought that you could simply affirm that you would implement the motion that you voted in favor of and the House voted unanimously in favor of. I hope we will still see a ban on double dipping, but it seems like there's not a clear commitment to do that. My next question is, the company started by Randy Boissonneau, GHI, has been suspended from getting government contracts. We think they should be banned permanently. Can you update us as to why they were suspended and whether the government is going to ban them completely?
So this would be a question for Minister Duclos at PSPC more than me, given that he has purview over government contracting. But I will say that the individual in question has, I understand, agreed to come to committee to answer questions, and I believe that question could be posed to him. In addition,
Is the individual in question Randy?
I will, I believe that that individual will be coming to committee. And in
Okay.
terms of the banning of contracts, which was the heart of your question, I will take that question back to Minister
Okay.
Duclos.
All
But
right.
the
I would
company-
love to see Randy at committee, by the way. One final question I want to get in the time we have. Indigenous leaders have repeatedly told this committee that Indigenous identity fraud is rampant in government, and that the proportion of real Indigenous businesses getting contracts isn't 5%, that it's closer to 1%. So how many businesses have been denied contracts or faced consequences for Indigenous identity fraud?
Well, I would agree that identity fraud is painful and harmful. And in terms of the numbers relating to companies denied contracts because they're not on the list, I don't have that information.
If I
I'm not
could,
sure
Mr.
if you
Chair, I
do.
can give a
I want to clarify, though, not because they're not on the list, because of Indigenous identity fraud. So that could be companies that misrepresented themselves in order to get onto the list, or who claim to be Indigenous businesses when they are not. We have, I think, over 1,000 businesses have been taken off that list. There may be various reasons, but one of them could be Indigenous identity fraud. So, but how many businesses have faced consequences or been denied contracts for Indigenous identity fraud?
give you a partial answer, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, partial answer. ISC, the department responsible for the actual list, does pre-contract audits as well as post. Latest information I have is they have done 14 audits in terms of pre-award audits. 2 have been found non-compliant. And there are 16 other audits, post-award audits, that are underway. No results yet.
Okay, so that's not really an answer about consequences, but 2 out of 14 companies that were audited are found non-compliant. That's not as high a proportion as we're hearing from Indigenous leaders, but that's still fairly significant. 2 out of 14. Have there been any consequences for those 2?
I'm afraid that is our time.
Can we get a follow-up in writing then? Have there been any consequences for those 2? I suspect there haven't been, frankly. But
Perfect. We'll go
We'll
to
find-
Mr. Halan. Welcome back. Go ahead for 5 minutes, please.
Thanks, Chair. Mr. Giroux, always great to see you. The food professor recently in a report highlighted how the carbon tax adds to the overall price of food because it increases the cost for down the supply chain. This is because there's a cascading effect, as we know, because down the supply chain, when there's a carbon tax on the farmer, there's a carbon tax on the transporter or the trucker, there's a carbon tax on the retailer who's selling the food. At the end of the day, Canadians who today are struggling more than ever to afford food because the cost of food has gone up, it all gets passed down onto them. Mr. Giroux, would you agree that the carbon tax has increased the cost or the price of food for Canadians?
All right, so I think the answer is obviously yes. If you have a fuel charge or any other type of levy that's imposed on producers of food or any type of goods, you'd expect some of these costs, if not the totality, to be passed on to consumers. I can't comment on the study that you're talking about because I haven't seen the methodology, but and we have not estimated.
Overall,
In theory,
yes.
yes. The magnitude is up for discussion.
Thank you. So recently, the government has introduced this 2-month tax trick where they're pausing the GST, HST on certain items. We know that GST is already not applied to a lot of the groceries. And in your report, as my colleague had highlighted, you had said about the carbon tax that it makes prices go up as income and makes incomes go down. Would you agree that to make things more affordable for Canadians, it's better to just take the carbon tax completely off of everything for everyone for good, instead of offering a temporary 2-month tax trick?
So that's a policy choice by the government because a fuel charge or a carbon tax is not just to generate revenues. It also has other objectives, reducing carbon emissions. And whether one is better than the other is really not for me to say. It's up to the government and legislators to determine.
But as comparatively, would it be more beneficial to have a permanent tax taken off as something like AXA tax, get rid of the carbon tax on food, gas, and home heating? Or is it better to just have a 2-month GST pause when it comes to affordability?
If you're talking about affordability and if the trade-off is between a 2-month tax reduction or a permanent reduction, I think the answer is quite obvious that a permanent reduction would be better to improve affordability.
Relaxing the tax would be better. You've also highlighted that this government, to no surprise, is going to blow through their budget deficit by $6.6 billion. This temporary pause, according to the government, is also going to add another $1.6 billion to the deficit at a minimum. What does this say about affordability for Canadians to have the government go even, further on their deficit? Is that going to help Canadians when it comes to affordability or make things worse?
Well, it depends on where these additional expenditures, if the increase in the deficit is due to higher expenditures, it depends where they are going. One thing that we can say for sure, though, is that when you have a higher deficit, other things being equal, it forces public debt charges to go up. And that's in good part why we have seen public debt charges go from the around $25 billion to 52 this year and expected to rise to 67 by 2030.
Mr. Giroux, I've been hearing from businesses about this temporary GST pause, this tax trick, that it's going to cost them because they have to change their POS systems twice, once before the change and once after the change. And this is happening during one of the busiest times of the year because it's around Christmas. We're hearing anywhere, some stores, from $1,000 to $1,500 each, and they don't see that there's going to be a benefit from this at the end of the day. Have you done any analysis on the impact on businesses from this pause?
No, we have not done a study or an analysis on that aspect.
Thank you very much, gentlemen.